Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Hagan. I am a partner at BDO, and I represent the not-for-profit industry. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cybersecurity. We're going to go through sort of the cyber landscape. I'm going to share a few examples with you of cases that have happened. We'll take a look at some of the priorities for the not-for-profits and see how you can prepare yourself or protect yourself against cyber attacks. We'll look at some tactics on how to do that, and if time permitting, we'll talk about some of the new PIPEDA changes. So as you might be aware, there's been an increase in cybercrime within the NPO space and in general. It's high enough these days that the federal government intends to spend over $500 million on cybersecurity. 98% of not-for-profits and charitable organizations use social media for marketing and fundraising. Social media followers and donor lists are valuable hacker resources. They get to you phishing emails to your donors, followers, and alumni, and they ask for money on your behalf. Impersonating your organization on social media is a commonplace tactic that they use. Cybercrime is a big threat to not-for-profit organizations. They take the theft of donor information, theft of any kind of personally identifiable information, and they take advantage of not-for-profits because they have a reputation of being an easy target. That is typically known in terms of the amount of money that not-for-profits spend in their IT environments. In short, not-for-profits have what hackers want. So what would your stolen data be worth? I find this an interesting slide because it references a lot of organizations you may be familiar with. And you might wonder why they would be stealing the data. But when we look at some of these accounts, like your Spotify account, those dollar amounts are per account. So you can imagine as these accounts are tapped into, and you think of companies like Spotify that would have hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of accounts, or Netflix, they hold a lot of data, so an attacker can get in and get a large amount of data very quickly. The dollar values escalate very quickly in these particular cases. The reason there's so much stolen data available is simply put, the hackers, they don't have a difficult time stealing this kind of information. It's important to understand also that the stolen data is being resold in the black market. There's something out there called the dark web, and a lot of the sort of underworld that we would call it have access to the dark web, and they use that as a place to transact these accounts. So let's take a look at the cyber landscape to get a better understanding of how and why these attacks are happening and what types of scenarios you might see. So there's some attacks that are more common than the others. The few that are most common are denial of services. This is an attack that involves flooding your server with requests. That means that the attacker will come in and continually start to try and access your server until it basically overloads the server. Phishing, these are emails aimed to trick recipients into clicking on fake links and divulge their credential information. So we've all heard of these type of emails where they'll log in pretending to be somebody they're not, maybe like the CRA. Your bank, and ask you to verify information, at which point then you actually divulge your credit card or username and password type information, and that gives them immediate access to that information very easily. Social engineering, using psychological cognitive bias to trick people into divulging information. This is one that'll say, click here for more information. It'll post something like a help desk number, but it's very psychological in kind of tracking what you're doing and what type of information you're interested in. It's a little bit like when you go on to an Amazon and you'll search for a particular item that you want to buy, and then in the next weeks following, you'll see emails or advertisements about the products that you were looking at. So that's the same type of thing. It's just used for a more deviant reason. A malicious insider. So these are people that work within your own organization. They could be disgruntled employees, selling or leaking information. They can be very dangerous, and so it's not always easy to identify those particular culprits. And then, of course, there's ransomware, which we've heard about more and more in the last few years. This is a malicious attack on your data, where the attacker will encrypt your data right on your hard drive, and then typically demand something like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency payment to unlock the files. Of course, there's all kinds of other attacks that we need to be aware of, and some of these are hard for us to identify, especially when they're new and emerging technologies, certain type of web attacks, and then just generally security breaches and insider risks. So let's talk a little bit about the phishing emails. I think we've all probably seen them and maybe even, had them pop up in our own organizations. Quite often they appear to be quite legitimate, right? So in this particular example, it's an iTunes account and it's, asking you to click on a link. They typically ask for some sort of action for you to take. And they'll be seeking information, whether it's names and addresses, usernames and passwords, or accounts and credit card information. The interesting part about this is that despite repeated warnings about phishing campaigns, emails remain the overwhelming method of fraudsters to rely on delivering malware. So that means that we are still, as a society, very susceptible to clicking or addressing these types of emails and allowing the fraudster into our environments. There's something also called spear phishing, which is kind of funny because we think about phishing in terms of the sport, but spear phishing is really the same as a phishing email, but it's tied to that psychological targeting that we talked about in the slide before. It means that they're actually thoughtfully going after a certain demographic or geography or some sort of controlled group, right? So it could be things that you're specifically looking at social media, and it's usually done at the executive level. So fake invoice messages are the #1 type in phishing lure, and the average click rate of a phishing email campaign is 20%. That means that at least 20% of the emails through phishing are clicked on. It only takes one person to open up the environment. So this is kind of a crazy slide, but I think it's worth talking about because I'm very interested in the timeline. So if you sort of follow the horizontal red line and from 2010 up until 2017, you will see the dramatic effect and impact of ransomware attacks on our infrastructures over the last, say 5 or 6 years, and how prevalent it is in the last 2 years. The ransomware activity has dramatically increased across the world, so not just in the NPO space, but we tend to be typical targets. Cyber criminals realize it's relatively simple to use and it's virtually untraceable, which is why they're dealing in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So let's talk about mobile malware. Fraud attempts through mobile channels is drastically increasing. If you think about our phones, we have them with us everywhere nowadays, and we're using them for more and more types of activities. Mobile platforms are one of the fastest growing targets for cyber criminals. Most of the cyber crime is now mobile, and it's over 60% of the online fraud activity that's happening. If we start to look at some of the statistics around the cyber platform for 2018, we'll see that the security is a non-negotiable. You need to have a strategy, and you need to be aware of all the types of attack surfaces that you can be engaged with. So when we look at some of these statistics, 146 days is the average time an attacker is in a network before it's detection. I find that a really scary statistic, to think that somebody's in your environment for, pretty much half a year before we even know they're there. Think of the amount of data they can have access to. If we look at 63%, that represents network intrusions of compromised user passwords. That means that if we don't have secure and passwords in place within our organization and actually enforce the changing of passwords within our resource pool, we are highly susceptible to having someone be able to infiltrate our networks. 41% of people who are unable to identify a phishing email. So we talked about that earlier, being one of the #1 ways that they gain access is through these phishing emails. And we all like to think we're smart enough to do better, but it is still the number of people that don't identify them and end up clicking on them is quite high. And then if we look at the $522, it's the average ransomware demand in 2018. This is the per account type cost that they're looking at. The number has dropped since 2017, which is really just a supply and demand. It means that they're having access to more and more ransomwares, so the cost is actually dropping because it can get, simply there's more people out there doing it. 60% of small businesses that go out of business after a cyber attack. This one is particularly concerning to me, especially in the NPO space, because our businesses, our organizations are there for a cause and causes, and they're not necessarily to make money. Yet the risk that we would face if we had a severe attack would be that our mission would likely go out of business, surely by the cost of trying to pay to recover. So that's an alarming statistic, and we want to make sure that we're not falling into those percentages. So let's take a look at a couple of case studies just to give you an idea of some of the things that are going on. So let's talk about the city of Atlanta. So they had a $2.6 million ransomware cyber attack. It basically crippled the critical municipal systems within the city of Atlanta. They were hit with a ransomware message locking their respective files and demanding approximately 50,000 Bitcoin in order to basically unencrypt their files. The ransomware was believed to have come from a group called SamSam, which has been operating since 2015. Now, you may not have heard of SamSam, but it's just an example that these are very organized and known organizations that are actually creating this fraud. They just, the ability to shut them down has been difficult. The interesting part about this attack was that they weren't able to get the all clear on their computers until 5 days after, and many of the city systems were still not recovered even after that. At least 1/3 of the 424 software programs that the city ran, they remain offline today and are inoperable. The cost of paying out the ransomware is only a portion of what happens. If you're lucky, they'll unencrypt data and life will move on, but more likely than not, there are programs that are either out of date version-wise, that when you recover them, they won't work unless the environments are updated. And the cost of that and the time of that is where you really get into trouble. So it was noted with the city of Atlanta that about $9.5 million would be needed to be added to the department's already $35 million operating budget for IT just to recover from the damages. So it's one thing to have to deal with the ransomware. It's another thing to have to recover afterwards and the updates that would be required. It is one of the reasons that you should have an IT strategy in place, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another one is simply financial. They had 90,000 clients, and two of the biggest retail banks reportedly suffered a data breach, receiving an email apparently from the hackers were demanding $1 million in cryptocurrency, or customer names and information would be released. So in this case, it was more that they were going to release private information to the public if they didn't get the ransomware. Email included unencrypted customer names, social insurance numbers, answers to security questions, and passwords that they stole. They believe in this case that the attack came from outside the country. So another interesting thing that we'll talk about, some tactics to protect yourself, will have to do with geography. So what are the top priorities for the NPOs? How are we going to take care of this, and how are we going to help ourselves so that we're not as vulnerable to the cyber attacks? The number one thing you can do is employee training. The more that we train our employees about phishing emails and how to protect themselves and protect your organization, the better off you are. I'll give you an example. I had a client of mine that was trying to be proactive in knowing where their company sat in terms of phishing emails. So they sent out just recently a Halloween Evite card through their network, and this was a controlled release. They did it themselves, and they wanted to get an idea of what the click-through ratio would be within their own organization. So we heard earlier it's a fairly high number, but when they took it down to their specific organization, they were shocked to find that 40% of their employees clicked on the Halloween card, even though it had no recognizable send. So it was sent by somebody that they wouldn't recognize. So that means they weren't expecting the email, they didn't recognize the sender, and felt compelled to open up the Halloween card. What it told them was a couple things. First of all, their employees still required further training. And second of all, they were surprised to find that it was their senior-most people in the organization that were clicking through at a higher ratio than their lower level staff. So that was a pretty compelling information. So what we do find with training, especially around cybersecurity, is that we typically will do training of employees on their onboarding. So when they join the organization, we'll talk to them about, password protection, phishing emails and security of locking their laptops. But we don't ever circle back around to it to make sure that they've been properly updated and reminded on an ongoing basis. So let's look at a couple training topics that you can implement right away. So leaving computers unlocked or unattended. If we ensure that users appropriately lock their machines when they're not in use, it's a very easy and quick way to secure that nobody's grabbing their laptop or data off their laptop when they're not looking. Teaching them about the phishing emails, as we talked about, so having them make sure that they're not opening unrecognized emails. I think we've talked a couple times about statistics, but 40% of individuals surveyed could not identify a phishing email. So that's different than not clicking on it. They're not even recognizing when they shouldn't click on it. So I know curiosity always gets the better of us in some cases, but the idea that they are not recognizing tells us that we need to provide them some training. The next one is remote working. As we've moved into of technology, where working from home or working from different locations is the norm. We have to remind our resources about the types of locations and where they are safe. So, for example, working in internet cafes, Starbucks or libraries or public places, there are people that sit in these locations and they'll basically do packet sniffing, allowing anyone to connect to the same hotspot and then looking at the data that's going across the traffic. And this includes emails, which some people may not be aware of. They should make sure always that they're using a secured, protected URL when they're trying to do any remote work like that. It's one of the reasons our mobile phones are susceptible is that we're carrying them with us all the time, and we may be connecting to public wireless networks on a regular basis. So we should be careful about the type of data that we're transferring there. Just a few other training topics that maybe are not completely technology driven, but are still good reminders. Is we have to remember to shred paperwork if there's private information on them and it's no longer necessary. Just throwing them in the garbage isn't always the best way. This used to be the way hackers would provide or gather information on us, was literally by going through the garbage. So it is important to make sure it's shredded. Having good data encryption policies. If somebody was to steal your laptop or phone or tablet, you want to make sure that it's encrypted. So you should have a company policy around that. Certainly backups. Unfortunately, we still see today that there's organizations that are either not backing up their data or they're backing it up within the same domain or environment that they keep their production environment. In the case of a cyber attack or a ransomware attack, if the data was actually backed up properly in a separate location that was not accessible at the same time, you would have a much better chance of being able to ward off the ransomware or fraudulent criminal by just simply restoring your data. Antivirus and firewalls are still very effective. They need to be kept up to date so that they are, as those new and emerging technologies are coming forward, that they're being able to filter them out. And then lastly, being aware of SSL certificates. This is just making sure you have a base level training that says that if a security warning pops up, that we don't blindly just accept them, but we may contact the vendor to say that their security certificate is out of date and it needs to be updated. Okay, so let's look at a few tactics on how we can prevent fraudulent donations or other fraudulent transactions within our organization. So creating a strong cybersecurity foundation. Grow your organization's understanding of the core cyber topics. What type of cyber threats, vulnerabilities, and attacks you could be subject to. Make sure that you have your risk management structure. So understand the risks that if you don't have some of the security positions in place, that you understand what the risks that you're facing in that case. Have intrusion prevention and detection. So we talked about the number of days that an attacker could be in your system. There are ways to understand, either prevent them from accessing or at a minimum detecting if they're there. Those are some things that you might want to consider. And then incident response and business continuity. I think we all have time talking about how to prevent a cyber attack, but we don't necessarily talk or have in place a plan should that happen to us. And that includes, communication either to the community or within our own organization. How do we maintain our business while we're going through that? So these are all the things that we don't like to have to worry about, but it is good that we have a plan should it happen. Undertake a risk assessment. So you don't want to rely on compliance alone. You want to make sure that you understand what your security gaps are and then understanding how you can prevent them. Some of the things that a risk assessment may involve is a penetration testing. This is a controlled attempt to access your system by somebody who's educated in how cyber criminals do access and try to then close those gaps. There's also a vulnerability assessment. This is just to look at different ways that they may gain access and to understand how vulnerable you are in those situations. The phishing test is much like the Halloween e-card that I talked about, a client of mine did. You can actually have yourself or organizations that are out there to help with these risk assessments. do a phishing test, which means they'll put a controlled email out to your organization and then measure the click-through or the opening of the email. You can go so far as to have unethical hacking. This is really about somebody actually hacking your system that is actually doing it for good and not for bad, and their purpose there is to identify where the hacks could get in. And then the encryption of the mobile devices, tablets, and phones. Review in-house development. So one of the areas that can be at risk, and it's not just to NPOs, but it is something that we've known for, is, again, the infrastructure side of things. Look at your software that's in place, and if there's custom development or custom, sort of access points, then you want to make sure that they have the proper security in place to make sure that they're not accessible through a backdoor developer or some other method like that. Make sure your vendors are providing information about their own cybersecurity practices. So as we're dealing more with cloud-type solutions, we'll want to make sure that if we're using a cloud-type vendor, that they have good security practices in place. Make sure that the data that you have is protected. This is following PCI compliance. It could be multi-factor authentication, so dual sign-in, credit card and payment information securely encrypted or stored in a vendor environment. So some of you may have worked with credit card companies that tokenize, and you store the token and not the credit card information. That's one way of protecting that particular vulnerable data. And then, of course, your IP security, trying to block certain types of IP addresses that are accessing your system. One of the ways that you can do this, if you know that you're not working outside of a specific geography, so maybe your organization only deals in Canada, then you can actually have your IP security tuned to not allow access from an IP address outside of your country. And that can limit down, as in the example from Simply, their attack, they believe, came from outside of the country, and had they had IP security to not allow access through an external geography, they may have been able to shut that down. And then lastly, just on your website, encrypting the traffic to and from the website using those SSL certificates. So keeping your donor data secure, there's a couple things here that you might want to consider. Clearly define what donor data can be released and under what circumstances. So this is educating your resources that they should not be releasing donor information, whether that be a third party or a known vendor request. There should be some kind of approval process within your organization before you release any data. Limit the number of staff that have access to donor data or any personal identifiable information. This is really just about controlling access to the data so that you don't have either internal resources that could be leaking data and that there's not an inadvertent risk to having data released. And then all donor data should be encrypted, tokenized, or using pseudonyms. So this is really around donor financial information. If you have recurring type donors that are using maybe credit card or EFT type transactions, you'll want to make sure that data is really secure. I think it's also really important to consider the social media. As good as social media is, and we've certainly watched as the world's evolved into the expansion that we can get in the world through social media. So it takes our advertising and our just general visibility of our cause to a higher level. But we have to be careful with the social media activity, and we have to monitor. This may mean checking our own Facebook pages and things like that to make sure nobody's impersonating them, and make sure that we have proper password management in place. We've identified and seen organizations, and in particular in the not-for-profit space, where Facebook pages have been copied and made to look exactly like our Facebook pages, and they actually then redirect the donations to a new page where they're taking the money from you. And if you're not checking, you may not even know that exists. So there's a paradigm shift, cybersecurity by design. We have to have a more proactive approach to cybersecurity. We can't sit back and wait for it to happen, and we can't not put our focus on this, because it is something that can actually be crippling to organizations. So let's talk a little bit about the changes for PIPEDA. It's important to note the date. It's very relevant. Just recently, in November 1st, 2018, we've released some new changes, and they have to do with around breach notification. This means that you now have to report to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner if there is a breach. You have to directly notify affected individuals. There could be indirect notification in special cases, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then record keeping of all breaches. So basically, under the new PIPEDA provisions, any kind of data breach or a breach of security needs to be recorded basically to the government under the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. They will at a level of harm and the real risk of significant harm to an individual. The term significant harm includes, among other things, bodily harm, humiliation, damages to reputation or relationships, financial loss, identity theft, and so on. So it is important to know that it now becomes the responsibility of the organization that has the attack to make these notifications. So an indirect notification must be given by public communication or similar measure that could be reasonably be expected to reach the affected individuals. So this is when you have a significant breach and there could be thousands of individuals affected, then it needs to be a public announcement. So again, there's going to be levels of harm that are identified, and then the course of action will come after that. It can even get to the point that the will then choose to have to monitor your systems on your behalf or put specific security compliances in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. So how do you prepare for this? Preparing for November 1st, we're already past November 1st, so these are things that should be front of mind for you now, is have some policies to ensure that you have the systems in place for internal monitoring and tracking of any kind of data breaches. Ensure that you have a policy in place to address containment of these notifications. So if you are part of a security breach, a cybersecurity attack, then make sure that you have a level of communication set up and an ability to assess the level of harm so that you can understand the communication strategy you need to follow. Make sure that you do notify the OPC or the Privacy Commissioner, and make sure that you understand what your what safeguards you do have in place for that communication. Like I said, they may come down to a form of regulatory investigations that they will have imposed on you to make sure that your systems are secure. And then have a game plan for the communication and the continuity of business so that you know how to respond to a cyber attack and that you're not thrown into chaos. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of not following the PIPEDA standards is that you could be fined, and that's something that none of us want to have happen. So the question is, are you prepared? Are you prepared to, in the case of a cyber attack, are you prepared in terms of educating your staff, and are you prepared in knowing that your systems are in a state of security where you can monitor and assess the risk of exposure? The time is now, and it is important for us as NPOs to pay attention to these significant technology advancements and understand that there is, unfortunately, a criminal activity hitting hard into the IT sector right now, and at particular risk is the NPOs due to the reputation of not necessarily spending the money or having the money to spend on tighter security practices. So I hope this information has been valuable to you. You know, it's unfortunate that we have to think about these things in our world, but it is better to have a proactive approach to cybersecurity than to be dealing with an attack and trying to recover from that. I'd be happy to answer any questions for you. You can email me at khagan@bdo.ca. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.